Hi, I'm Larry Peabody with the Bakke Graduate University, and with us today is Brian Doten, pastor of Northwood Church in Maple Grove, Minnesota. I first came to know Brian while doing research for my book, Curing Sunday Spectatoritis. I learned then that Sunday meetings at Northwood regularly include what they call faith stories. In fact, in this lesson, you've already listened to a recording of one of those stories by Rachel Bickler. So, Brian, in your Sunday meetings, you include what you call faith stories. How did you come up with that name, and what does it mean?
So the Faith Story name really originates from our parent church. Northwood Church is one of 9 daughter churches from Wooddale Church, which is a larger church in the Twin Cities area. It was pastored for 35 years by a man named Leith Anderson. And when I first started going to Wooddale Church as a college student, they had something at that time called the witness stand. The witness stand was a prepared testimony that somebody would share on Sunday mornings in the morning services that was 5 minutes in length, that was intended for that person to share how they became a believer, how they chose to follow Jesus Christ. And at times also, the focus may be not just on their personal story of conversion, but also of how they're seeking to be a witness to somebody else or to other people. So that was the idea of the witness stand. It's somebody who's explaining their testimony of what they know and what they've seen, what they've heard.
Mm-hmm.
And that. So that was way back in the early 1980s when I was a college student.
Oh.
And then I joined the staff of Wooddale as a youth pastor. And about 5-6 years later, in the mid-'80s, we had a big discussion in our staff meeting because Leith felt that the phrase witness stand was not sort of culturally identified, or it wasn't fitting the culture anymore, that it had more of a, what I think probably would be understood as a defensive posture, like you're being accused or you're being asked. And it kind of morphed into what became a softer name and probably a more accurate name, and that is the faith story, the story of your faith, of how you came to believe in Christ. And that's important to know, that it's a faith story, not a life story. Obviously, life circumstances are influential in somebody's faith and how they come to believe and how they grow in their faith, and even how they share their faith. But it's intended to be a faith story about your life before you became a Christian, your life and how you became a Christian, and then your life since you became a Christian. And that's kind of a longer answer probably to the name in terms of what you asked, but it started with witness stand and morphed into faith story. And when I became the pastor of Northwood Church in 2005, because I had coached people at Wooddale for nearly 15 years, had recruited and coached people to do that in our services, and it was so well received at Wooddale. In fact, often I would hear, as when in the midst of Leith Anderson's great preaching, people would often say to me, that's my favorite part of the service, when people share their story.
Mm.
It was something that I purposely brought with me from Wooddale to Northwood Church, that we would do faith stories in our services on a regular basis. And it's been equally well received. And again, I hear often the comment, Brian, no offense against your preaching, but I really like those stories.
Yeah. How long have you been using the faith stories in your Sunday meetings at Northwood?
Well, since I came as the interim pastor in 2005.
So it's been 12 years then.
Been 12 years, yeah. And we're still strong in them, and we'll continue to do them as long as I'm the pastor at Northwood.
And how frequently do you incorporate faith stories into your Sunday meetings?
Well, if you have a typical month of 4 Sundays, we will do them approximately 3 Sundays a month. The 4th Sunday is a communion Sunday, and because in our service it takes about 10 minutes to introduce communion, pass out the elements, and do the communion part of the service, and sort of eat it and drink it together, kind of the family's approach in communion.
Mm.
We do them on the 3 other Sundays. Now, I should say that sometimes in that schedule, there could be a missionary report, there could be a ministry report. So it's not hard and fast 3 times a month, but on the average, typically 3 times a month, we'll do a faith story.
One of the things that really struck me when we talked before, when I was interviewing you for the book, was the coaching process. Could you kind of describe the coaching process that you use to prepare people to tell their faith stories?
Sure. Well, the coaching process actually begins with the recruitment of people to do their faith story. So how do you find people to do a faith story? Well, the best example I would know is that if you're a preaching pastor or a speaking pastor, you know that you're always scouting for good illustrations and good stories to share in your sermons. And the same thing is true of the faith stories. You're always sort of scouting for a person or the people that are going to be candidates to share their faith story. So doing membership interviews with people, personal appointments with people. I sometimes will go back through my calendar the last 2-3 months when I'm scheduling faith stories, recruiting people, and jog in my mind, who have I talked to and what have they shared with me about what's going on in their life, because sometimes it's hard to keep track of all that. There have been a few times I've actually gone through the membership directory or the attendance directory of our church. There's about 500 people, and who is it that maybe has a story? I will literally pray before I go through the directory and say, Lord, who here has a story that you want people to hear? And so I developed kind of a prospect list, and then I will look at the preaching schedule for the next 3 to 4 months out. And typically I try to work at least 2 months out in the faith stories, and I really shoot for 3 months. So people, this is not like next week will you share your faith story. This is several months and several weeks so people can think about it and be working on it and give their best effort that way, their best thinking on it, as well as because it takes time to coach them if you need to do any editing with their story. So I will schedule it out, and I'll try to, if it's possible, if there's a theme that we're talking about in the message or the service, if I know that person's story that might connect with that theme, then I'll try to make that connection. Although what I have found over the years is, you can kind of try to force that, and God has this amazing way of, when you're working on your sermon or the service, the person that has been scheduled, God makes some supernatural connections between their story and your service theme and your message theme that it really is only from the work of God. So it begins with recruitment and then the ask. I have found too that over the years in doing this, that when I email somebody or I talk to them, and I've discovered over the years, especially most recently, that email is a better approach for me to invite people as compared to the personal call on the phone. The reason being is that whenever I would call somebody on the phone, the initial reaction was like, oh, you want me to do that? I mean, people, as you know, their biggest fear is public speaking. And so they kind of get taken aback a little bit, and they're kind of fumbling with their response. So often by the phone, I just simply would say, well, why don't you think about this and pray about this and see what you think, and then come back to them at a later time. So what I've discovered is if I email people, and in that email, invite them to do it, and in that email, explain the reason why I've invited them, then that really goes along with, then they can kind of respond as they think about it, and they're not put on the spot to give an answer with something that you're kind of coming at them, which is a pretty big commitment for them to do it. And then with the coaching, after the recruitment and the ask, then we send guidelines. We have written guidelines that are about a page in length that help people to think about what they're going to say. Some basic coaching principles in that are, again, this is your faith story, not your life story. So focus in on your faith and how Christ has come into your life, how Christ has changed your life. And then to pray about what they're going to say, to write it out. And we even, the guidelines give the suggested length of how they write this out, that we have 5 minutes in our service devoted for the faith story. And that typically is about a page and a third or so, give or take somebody's speed by which they talk. About a page and a third of 12-point font, single space lines and margins. So, and we give that guidelines to them. And in the guidelines also is the request, the ask, that they send me a copy of their story, typically 2 weeks in advance. And honestly, I'll just mention that rarely do I get it 2 weeks in advance. There's not that many people that have that kind of personal discipline. They're kind of mulling it over and working on it. And then, but I'll get it the week of typically. And in the week of, I'll do some editing with them if necessary, if need be. But I've discovered too that once this gets established in the church, people are hearing these stories week after week after week. And so they sort of have already in their mind, you know, if I were to say this, or if I were to do that, they kind of know what sort of the culture is about, and they'll kind of self-edit is what I'm saying in that. One of the things we try to be really clear about also in the guidelines is this is not a time in any way to disparage a denomination or a person or a previous church if they had a bad experience, because sometimes that kind of leaks out. We live in a predominantly Lutheran and Catholic culture, and where faith is kind of more about ritual at times and more about the church than it is about personal conversion. And sometimes people from those backgrounds, when they discover personal faith in Christ, they can be a bit critical and sometimes even harsh about their upbringing or about their religious past, their spiritual past. And we try to really soften that to make sure that it never doesn't come across as a negative thing.
So it sounds like you've really changed the culture of the church because you've done this for so many years.
Yeah, it's become part of the culture, and it has shaped who we are in a significant way. So the last part, after I send the guidelines, just to review that, is that they send me that copy, and then I look it over and give any edits or suggestions back to them. And then also including the guidelines are day of instructions, right? I make sure they know what do they do, what time do they show up at church? Because we want to have them come early enough that we include them in the pre-service prayer time we have with all the service personnel, that they get included in the talk through of the service order, so they're real clear about when they're going to be up in the story. Because sometimes we move the story around to different parts of the service. Typically, it's at the same part every week, but we'll move it around every now and then for variety's sake, and if it's appropriate to do that. And then also we pray them up in that pre-service prayer time, so they feel the encouragement and they feel included in the Sunday morning schedule in that. So I think that's the sort of the coaching process. And there's a bit where you coach by the culture, you coach by the guidelines, and then you coach with just a little bit of suggestions here and there with regard to what they've written.
Could you summarize a few of the examples of Christians who are telling their stories of ministries in the scattered church, like workplace, neighborhood, family, that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of those I think you Larry, included in your book is the Brandon Kohler illustration. Brandon is a young guy. He and his wife came to our church newly married, and he, as he was coming to church and as he's listening to faith stories, he was kind of prompted himself about what he could do to be a witness in his workplace. And I can't even remember the impetus for this, the stimulus, but one of the things that he initiated in the workplace was for him to put a change cup out for all of his colleagues, that they would collect as much change as they could from their personal pockets in the course of a month, and then they would deposit that at the end of the month over the course of time that amounted to a significant sum of money. And I believe what they did is they went to a local faith-based ministry here called Feed My Starving Children, and they purchased food for people that don't have food, that live with food insecurity all around the world. So Brandon was kind of prompted by what he was hearing and he experienced in a church to do something in the workplace, which really was a very positive thing. There's a woman named Jan Johnson in our congregation who, because of what she's experienced in church and the way her life has become, her faith has become really alive to her, she began to witness to the people in her grocery store where she goes. Evidently, she visits the grocer a couple times a week, and just by virtue of being friendly to the staff that work there, from the guy in the meat market to the people in the checkout lane, she became known as the prayer lady, asking if she could pray with people and pray for people. And it got to the place where when she'd come by, they would come to her and say, "Would you please pray for me?" And they would share prayer requests with Jan. So something which is kind of a wonderful thing. And you would never expect, if you knew Jan, she's not going to teach Sunday school. She's not going to, be a real verbal person in her faith. But for some reason, the grocery store is like home for her, and those are her people. And she's a bit shepherding those people. It's kind of like a small group for her of folks. So that's kind of a neat story. I think another story just recently that we heard was Rachel Bickler is somebody that students have been asked to listen to their faith story. Rachel is married to a man named Matthew Bickler, and Matthew went to a refugee camp with our youth pastor. Northwood Church, the church that I pastor, we are all in on the refugee ministry. That's something that for us is really important. It's a calling we feel from God. And we do it at both ends of what's called the refugee highway. We resettle refugees here through Arrive Ministries, which is the former World Relief Minnesota. And then also we go to a refugee camp in Kenya, and we spend time with refugees there. And there's some projects that we've taken on there in the refugee camp. Well, Matthew went just this past April, so 3 months ago, with our regular annual visit, and has come back so excited about what he experienced, but also moved deeply in what he experienced in the refugee camp, that he now has taken on the project of providing a well for people at what's called an IDP, an internally displaced persons camp, which is outside the refugee camp. These are the poorest of the poor. And he has committed $100 a month, and he's gave an invitation to all of his family and friends, everybody's network, to join him in trying to raise $80,000 to provide water for these folks in this IDP camp, independent or internally displaced persons camp. He has said he's going to give $80 a month until the well is built. And so he shared that vision with us. I think God's going to honor that brother's faith and that brother's commitment to do that. There's another story too. There's an older gentleman in our church who plays the accordion. I mean, how many people play the accordion these days? And he actually is in a couple of accordion clubs here in the metro area that, and he traveled to a national convention, I think it was, for accordion players, or some national gathering in New Jersey. And while he was there, he engaged in conversation with somebody else who's an accordion enthusiast and lover, and shared his faith. The conversation turned to spiritual things. And before he's done with the conversation, he had a chance to share his faith in Christ with her. So what he has done is, seen, of course, the call to be a witness, and he shared that story with us as a faith story. And it's just a reminder that wherever we go, no matter what our hobbies are, no matter our jobs, we can be a witness if we're open to the opportunity. And Frank did a good job with that. The final story I'll share is with a high school athlete who's just graduating from high school. He just graduated actually 2 months ago in May. And he was an all-star football player for the state of Minnesota. So they have at the end of the year, they have an all-star football game between the different regions in the state, kind of the metro area and the outstate. And this guy was in the metro area. He's a decent football player. He's a good football player. And at the time, they were going to do a banquet the night before the game. And this was with a crowd of 400 or 500 people, athletes and their parents. And with the athletes there in the practice field just before they broke, they kind of shower up and go to the banquet. They asked, would anybody be willing to give a prayer for the food? And, a bunch of football players, macho guys, nobody was raising their hand until Jack raised his hand and said, I'd be happy to pray. And so Jack gave the invocation for the meal and thanks for the food in front of his peers, these big stud football players and all the parents at the banquet, and just a kid who stepped up to live his faith and share his faith in a public way. So he told that story also in a faith story, and reminded us that God gives us all opportunities if we'll just step into those opportunities and be brave and courageous. So I got 3 or 4 more, Larry, but that's about it. On to the next question, okay?
Have you ever seen any evidence that these faith stories are changing other believers in their scattered church ministries?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one of the great outcomes, unintended outcomes, we think of these faith stories as really kind of to encourage people in the service, but people get inspired. They get fired up. And there's a personal connection that people feel with those sharing their story when they say, I can do that. Or they say, me too. They identify with what the person is saying. So I think they leave services more equipped and inspired to be a witness, to share a witness, and be bold and courageous for God because of what they hear. They expect a pastor to get up and talk about these things. And that's kind of our occupation. That's our job. But when somebody from the church talks about being a witness and shares a story of how they're trying to be a witness, it just really is, that's gold.
That really sounds like spurring one another on then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, very good. Why do you record the faith stories, and any accounts of how these recordings have been used to equip other believers in the scattered church?
Yeah, well, we record them like we record all the messages. We're a medium-sized church. We're a church that worships right now 270 people on a Sunday morning. So we're not a big church, but we're not a small church. We're kind of that church in between. And we don't have a staff person designated to put the recordings on the website that we have. So we have a volunteer that does that, and it's a bit of a challenge, honestly, right now to get consistency with regard to getting all those get those faith stories put on the website, even get the sermons put on the website. So I would imagine that if you're in a church our size or even smaller, you understand the challenge of that as compared to having a paid staff person who this is their job every week to put it on there. But I do know that when it's on there, people have gone there. Our metrics the reports that we get of people who visit our website tell us that people do visit that. I think, though, that one of the great things that happens in this is that the person who shares their story, they will often let their family and their friends know about doing their story, and that will bring their people to church. In other words, their crowd comes to listen to them. And that also, if people hear that story, they will encourage others that they know that might connect with that story to go listen to the story. So there's it spreads its way out in a network in a positive way, in a good way.
You may already have covered this, but looking back over several years of experience with faith stories, what key insights have you gained?
Well, here's a couple that I thought about, Larry. First of which is that these are just really powerful spiritual moments in our congregation. It's not uncommon for there to be tears, either from people listening or people sharing. As people share their stories, sometimes are kind of they're moved themselves with what they're talking about because it's deeply personal. And for people who listen, I know I get often moved to tears because I know more of the story than sometimes is being shared. So they are powerful moments emotionally, but also spiritually. Spiritually, the truth that Jesus Christ changes lives. That's the consistent message. And that is a wonderful truth to communicate every week. And then also, I think an insight is just the relationships that get built because of this. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said sort of his definition of community is me too. When people understand that they thought they were the only person who either struggled with that or had that thought or that experience, but when they hear somebody else that has that experience, then they say me too. And I think that happens with the faith stories. People sit there and go, me too, and with what the person is sharing. And then, as I mentioned also, often a person who's sharing their story will invite family and friends to come listen, and those become evangelistic opportunities, evangelistic moments. Because not everybody's cousin or brother or parent is a believer. And when they come and they listen, it's a powerful influence. A good example of that was this last Easter, a woman who is a newer believer to our church, a newer believer and newer to our church as well. I asked her to do her faith story, and Deanne did that. And there was probably 15 to 20 people from her world, most of whom that don't go to our church and don't go to church period, that came to listen to Deanne. And they heard Deanne's faith story. which is really clear about how Christ has changed her life and given her victory over a struggle with alcoholism and drug use and just poor living, poor choices. And then they heard the message of Easter. And it was really, I thought, just a powerful Sunday for that. So they're powerful moments. They are essential to our worship. It's hard for me to imagine now services without faith stories. Another key insight I would say is one person needs to own this. This is something that somebody needs to manage and lead and do. So in other words, one person who says, I'm going to lead that. I'm going to make sure we do that. So they schedule the faith stories, they recruit the people, they coach the people. Now also I should mention that while I'm that person for Northwood Church, there are times I hand off that responsibility to one of my staff members. So for instance, last Sunday, our children and family pastor was speaking, and it was a holiday weekend, and we had just come off Vacation Bible School a week and a half earlier. And so I asked him to recruit a child that would be able to do the faith story. And so he did that, and he recruited a 10-year-old child who gave her faith story, which, if I could just do a little parenthesis here, Larry. So last Sunday, and kind of along the lines of what you advocate for in your writing. So last Sunday, we had a 10-year-old child share a faith story, but a 67-year-old man, a Vietnam veteran, because it was the July 4th weekend, we prayed for our country. I asked him to pray for our nation, for our country. And of course, and he included the military in that. And then we also had a time of personal, private, silent prayer for everybody in the congregation, praying for a mission team that was in the Pine Ridge. So, and then we had in the worship team, we had a teenager, and we had a recently retired man, and then other band members as well, more middle-aged. But we just sort of had the gambit of ages. And I, at lunch with my wife, I just said, wasn't that great?
No, I love it. I love it.
It was the church gathered, but the church, all of us, from 10 years old to 70 years old, participating and leading in ministry in that. But anyway, back to it. So one person owns it and schedule it. And then also, I can't say this enough, this is a faith story, not a life story. And I think as you get started with doing this, that's going to be a bit of a challenge because, some people may feel strongly about, well, I need to include this, but, it's important to them, but it's not really going to be helpful to the story. And you need to keep the main thing, the main thing. And the main thing is about how Christ has changed your life. And so to help people understand that is really critical. And I would say this last key insight is get started, maybe just do one a month. I know some of the daughter churches have started that way. And even some of the people that worked at Wooddale when I was there. Let me give you a great story, a good example of that. There was an intern we had that, and as he graduated from seminary and went to a church in Kansas, he thought faith stories was a great idea. So he got there, he was an associate pastor, he convinced the senior pastor to do it, and then they recruited somebody to do it, and the person went for 17 minutes. They went on and on and on. And within 3 days, within a couple of days after the faith story, he emailed me and say, "You have guidelines, right? Can you please send me a copy of those guidelines?" So the importance then of, as you get started, to sort of set the standard for what is going to be done. So make sure you have written guidelines in place. Make sure the people that you started with are people that you have some confidence in how they're going to do this. That it's like often, when you lead a small group, often the person who asked the question, the opening question, will lead with an answer. When you're talking about the icebreaker, sort of set the tone for. So this is sort of like the standard or the expectation or kind of what it is that you're looking for. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. In fact, you've really anticipated the last question, is if you were going to suggest to someone, church leader, how they could start this in their church. But I think you've already touched on that. Anything more that you would say in terms of how to really equip them to equip others to help believers out there in the scattered church?
Yeah, I would say begin with prayer about doing this. I would say put in place the support systems you need to get. I'd be happy to share our guidelines. I took the guidelines that we drafted at Wooddale and morphed them into Northwood version, and so I'd be happy to email anybody our guidelines, and then they can take a look at it and make it fit their context, their culture. in that, and then begin with people that you have the confidence in terms of doing the story, the first couple. So you have a good sense. I would say this, in some ways, a faith story is, some of us grew up in the life of the church and we remember testimony night, and Sunday night services when we had those, or we remember, in church camp, the Friday night testimony time around the campfire. This is kind of more of a formalized thing. It's the same deal, but it's just formalized and it's brought into the context of the Sunday gathering, not those the Sunday morning worship service, not those other gatherings. I would also mention this that I think is a really interesting connection. So I subscribe to Christianity Today the news magazine. It's become the gold standard for, I think, news magazines for Christians, for pastors and for leaders. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but in the last year or two, they have now included in the back page article a faith story, a written faith story. And when I get my Christianity Today magazine, what is the first article I go to? I don't even look at the table of contents. I just go right to the back page because they have a faith story there. So one of my close friends, my former colleague at Wooddale, John Somerville, is on the board of CT. So I emailed him just this last week to say, John, did you have any influence with Christianity Today publishing these faith stories in the magazine? Because I've noticed them and I really like them. They're really powerful. And John emailed me back and he said, no, he didn't have influence, but it has been one of the most well-received articles now in Christianity Today, that they get all kinds of positive response and feedback from the faith stories in CT, in Christianity Today. So I think we're onto something that's really important with these.
Oh, this is great. If someone did want to get your guidelines, what is your email address?
Sure. It's Brian.Doten, so BRIAN .Doten, DOTEN, Brian.Doten at Northwood.cc. Again, at Northwood.cc. CC stands for Community Church. Yeah, I'd be happy to send those guidelines out.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your taking the time to spend with us, and I'm sure that what your comments have included are going to be a great help to many people. So thank you, Brian, and Lord bless.
All right, you too, Larry. Great to visit with you.
Okay, yeah. Bye-bye.